before entering, we had another operation that was quite large, but nobody remembers because what we call Protective Edge, Sukeitan, or the 2014 war kind of overshadowed the other operation that came before, which was called My Brother's Keeper, in which we searched in the West Bank for the bodies, what became known to be the bodies, but were kidnapped teenagers. And during those weeks of being in the West Bank, just to give you like kind of the mindset that I entered Gaza with, we were told we're searching for these teenagers, but we were also taking advantage of this moment where there's like public legitimacy to display power and more force in the West Bank. So we were basically searching for them, but also demonstrating our presence, our power, and also searching for any clue for anything suspicious, which is basically anything that you decide is suspicious. And so for weeks during this operation, I don't remember exactly how many days, I was a commander and I was choosing homes to enter and to invade and to search, which basically means to enter a house in the middle of the night of a family, flip all the furniture, terrify the family, not find anything usually because you're just choosing homes randomly and move on. When the idea is kind of, we will display our force and then they will regret ever like basically fucking with us. And doing these missions as a commander already started to really bother me. And I started to question the whole mission that we were doing. But then Hamas started shooting rockets from Gaza, and we are told that we're preparing for an invasion into Gaza. And I come with all these questions and a feeling that I'm not very motivated or not really believing in this kind of system that I'm serving. So entering Gaza was already something that was kind of complicated for me because I wasn't sure I believe in it, you know, and what we're doing. But I was so committed to my teammates or my unit mates, the guys that were serving with me, which are still good friends until today, even though I'm an anti-occupation activist. I felt like I don't really have the option to not go in. So entering already was kind of a complicated moment for me. And every time there is a war in Gaza, we can speak more about what I saw and what I did and what I think about it. But every time there's an escalation, it's not like there was 2014 and now the 7th of October, 23. Every year in Israel, we have what we call a round of violence, which is a normalized way of calling basically aggression, escalation, war, violence. Every time this happens, which is quite often, it brings me back to that moment where we crossed the fence into this place that we've never been into, and we only heard scary things about, where everybody inside are terrorists that want to kill you.
You know, this speaks on the brainwashing that's done to the Israelis themselves as well. And one of the interesting things he said is how they provoke them. They go to their houses and they provoke them, they scare them, they intimidate them. And this is something that the Palestinians have been saying for years, decades. And it's just getting into our Western media. But this has been going on forever because what they see in the Western media is just the reaction. They don't see what the IDF soldiers have been doing, the most moral army in the world has been doing.
I mean, it's just that point about civilians, I suppose, because you said, you know, you were kind of, what's driven into your heads is that these are terrorists or extremists. And we've heard, I suppose, from senior Israeli politicians talking about things like human animals, that there were no innocents in Gaza, as the former foreign minister Avigdor Lieberman put it, for example. The Israeli president, I suppose, talking about collective guilt, that kind of stuff. I mean, you wrote in the Guardian article, really good, brilliant Guardian article you wrote, since the Israeli military had ordered civilians to leave the neighborhood, anyone who remained was, so we were told, a Hamas operative or supporter and therefore a legitimate target. I'm just interested in that because obviously in terms of the rules of war, that isn't how the rules of war work in terms of international law, Geneva Conventions. But so I'm interested kind of how that was expressed and how that actually played out on the ground.
There's a logic behind the way we fight in Gaza. The way I experienced it, and I don't think it changed ever since, is that you tell the residents of a certain neighborhood that you want to fight in, or do you want to conquer, that you're coming in, and they have to leave. They have an X amount of time to leave. So once you warn them, in your eyes, whoever stayed is either actively participating in the war as a Hamas member or collaborating because we told them to leave. So once you warn the population, this area becomes a battleground. It's not a neighborhood anymore. At least in your eyes, as a soldier, you did your part, or you did what you needed to do to tell them to get away. So if they stay, it's their fault.
See, this is very interesting. In the media, what they say is that they find Hamas people and then they give a warning in that neighborhood that you guys all better leave or else, because we're going to destroy this area. But what actually happens is that they just go to a neighborhood and say, you guys better leave because we're taking over in a few, whenever. And the people that don't leave, they just automatically turn them into Hamas. They got to be Hamas then. And it's crazy because who decides who's Hamas, who's not? Israel does, basically. In our media today, Israel decides who's Hamas and who's not, period.
And you don't really stop to think about that too much. And most people don't also after they leave the army. And for many in Israel, that's even considered something that's too humane. Like, why are we doing this? When actually it's just a way of legitimizing the area to be a battleground. It's not actually, I don't think it's actually to help people save their lives. We treat neighborhoods as battlegrounds, and we treat it as total war. And we don't want to deal with civilian populations. We don't make a difference. Whoever stayed is a legitimate target. Then we enter with much another level of engagement, of firepower that I've ever seen. It's completely a different scale. And there's this idea of we take zero risks on our own soldiers. So the way you enter is with very, very heavy artillery and bombings from above, from the sky. And this makes you feel much more confident as a soldier who's entering. And it leaves a level of destruction that I've never experienced before in anything I did in the West Bank. Another example for that could be the way we enter homes in Gaza. Before that, in the West Bank, you maybe invade a home. You're not really asking if you can enter or not. You maybe break the door, you maybe kick the door, or do whatever you need to get in. But in Gaza, you don't even go through the door because it might be trapped. So you fire a rocket from a shoulder rocket into the wall, and you enter through the wall. So the way we're engaging with this whole area is completely different. We were there for 2 weeks, I'd say maybe 3. And as you're there, you start to see it becomes more difficult to treat the place as if it's just a battleground because you're actually staying in people's homes. At least that's the way it was for me. You start seeing family photos, signs of life of people who live in this place, school books. We heard of a family that one of our units met in one of the homes, and they later died in the bombings from above, from fighter jets. So this kind of idea that everybody is just who stayed is engaged in fighting, and that we're in a battleground. It's hard to keep it when you actually see that you're in a neighborhood. And to your point, that has to do with the dehumanization. I think once you start to question that, or to feel like that idea crack, then you have 2 options. Either you start questioning the whole thing that you're doing, or you have to turn to dehumanization.
There are so many things I want to say here. So first of all, the Israeli propaganda, they can fool the Western worlds who aren't actually boots on the ground and seeing what's going on, but you can't fool your military. And props to this guy for seeing it for what it is. The other thing I wanted to say is, could you imagine just entering a house, instead of breaking the door open, you fire a rocket through the wall and get in? Who knows who that kills, what kids that kills? Those innocent kids could die, right? And you just don't care. You just shoot it through the wall. And just seeing these pictures, and it reminds me how, Eid just happened. And you see posts on Instagram of people finding kids with brand new Eid clothes on, just dead on the floor. It's depressing. And there's a study I read about, or I watched a video on recently, that said that They are doing more drone strikes and throwing bombs from a plane and all of that because it's easier to dehumanize. It's much harder to dehumanize someone when you as a person are fighting with them on the battleground in person. For both sides, it's harder to dehumanize. You can't just call them animals when you see them with their families, with their children, and everything. Because, humans are humans. They all want the same thing. They want peace. They want families. But, yeah.
Because then if you don't do that, you're left with a lot of guilt, I believe.
I mean, linked to that, do you think that IDF soldiers currently in Gaza have vengeance, I suppose, in their heads? And that vengeance is being maybe legitimized by, I suppose, those higher up in the army, but also politicians. And when I say vengeance, it doesn't simply mean in their heads, say, identifying Hamas members, for example, but the risk is any civilian in Gaza could be on the receiving end of that vengeance. What's your sense of kind of how many IDF soldiers maybe are currently thinking right now, and how sanctioned that might be?
I think naturally, after seeing what happened on the 7th of October, people, not only soldiers, everybody in Israel might have this feeling that they want revenge. Maybe it wore down by now, but even I maybe felt it to a certain extent,
Mm-hmm.
But what's sad and what's different these days is that this kind of feeling and this desire for revenge and this idea that we don't need to make a difference between Hamas operatives and civilians isn't just something that you feel inside and you kind of want to feel, and you might feel ashamed of it. It's completely normalized by the highest ranks, not only in government, which is already really fucked up, but they're, I guess, trying to be populist and to ride this wave of hate. But also you can see this from within higher ranks in the army, which is really frightening. Like, we need to flatten out Gaza. There shouldn't be anybody left there after we finish this war, or it's about time we finish them once and for all. All kinds of statements like that have become something that are quite normal around me, sadly. And they become normalized because of our leaders, first of all.
When you saw those images, as we've all seen images, video footage of Palestinian men stripped nearly naked down to their underpants and paraded in front of cameras. I mean, a former British soldier made the point that removing clothes of people isn't in itself something which you wouldn't see in a military operation, check for suicide belts, things like that. But doing mass arrests where people are stripped and then paraded in front of cameras obviously contravenes the Geneva Conventions. It's very clear that you can't do that according to international law. But what's your sense of when you saw those images and footage? There are also allegations that were obviously taken away, and allegations of torture, that kind of thing. What's your sense of what's happening there? How it's been justified, and what the purpose is?
We need to start understanding that we're in the jungle and we need to play according to the jungle rules. So maybe something like that, according to that logic, is kind of showing them, oh, you messed with us, you really messed up this time, which has been proven for years, from whenever I was alive at least, that this never caused any more safety or security, only caused the opposite. It caused more escalation and more violence and more feeling that there's no safety. But what I think that the deeper and maybe the real reason for these images is to serve the Israeli society. I think Israeli society needs to feel like we got back at them, that we're causing them pain, that we're inflicting damage on them, that we're maybe even humiliating them. I'm not saying everybody, but I think that these kinds of images serve that desire for sure, that our leaders and the leadership are searching for victory images. And I think that actions as like these, like humiliating photos and destructions of huge structures like universities and mosques and these kinds of videos are there to serve that kind of desire for a victory image, that an Israeli can sit in their home and watch TV or be on the internet and feel like this desire for a victory image has been fulfilled. But I think that's fake. It's a fake victory. It's a very shallow victory, because where is it leading us? I don't think it's leading us anywhere. And I think it's it's also quite shameful that this is where we've gotten to, that we find joy and we find satisfaction in the humiliation of others and destruction of others.
Another good point. A lot of the tactics that the IDF does is just to humiliate people, Palestinians basically. Like you'll see them humiliating fathers in front of their wives and their children, and humiliating mothers and wives and all of that. They do this on purpose just to get into their heads. You see clips of this everywhere, X, TikTok, and it's disturbing. And okay, so if you do that kind of stuff, own it. Don't call yourself the most moral army in the world. You're far from that.
You have more targets. The targets might be less important, and your collateral damage that you allow around it, which basically means innocent people dying, becomes higher. Every war, every round of violence in Gaza, this kind of equation changes, in which the target, we're more liberal, I think, with the way we allow collateral damage. And then you have to think about what it means, a military target. If there is a Hamas member who was verified to be in a certain building, I don't know exactly because I'm not the one choosing the targets, but that might make the whole building become a target, right? So we need to think about what that means from the Israeli side. If we would think it would be justified, let's say, if a high-ranked Israeli officer or just an Israeli soldier walked into an apartment one time and had dinner, or lived in a building, does that mean that everybody around becomes a legitimate target? And I think as we dominate Palestinians more, especially in this way in which we do it in Gaza, I think as a people, as a society, we become much more tolerant to deaths of civilians. And it's coming to a point right now where what we talked about before, where people actually claim that there is no such thing as an innocent person in Gaza. This is a gradual process that's reaching a peak, I hope, because if this isn't the peak, then I don't want to know what the peak is.
Obviously, well, we would agree that this didn't begin on 7th of October. It goes back many, many decades. The context of occupation, of siege, and so on. But the point I was just that point about dehumanization and what occupations do to occupiers. And we were talking just before I put the video on about the experience of, for example, Britain and Ireland, and the Irish were dehumanized in a way which I think lots of people who grew up in the 90s onwards don't actually often understand, because Irish culture suddenly became sexy, Irish music, that kind of thing. It was something kind of like that was not how Irish people were generally treated. They were they were portrayed as subhuman, as innately brutish, as violent, as uncivilized. And that was and there was a famous way of summing this up in terms of even in the 1950s, 60s, of signs which would say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And I'm just interested because there was nothing unique in that sense about this. But I'm just interested in that dehumanization, how many Israeli citizens have come to see Palestinians, and whether that can ever shift, and how, because that level of dehumanization is required to sustain this level of oppression and occupation. Because if you, as you said, when you start seeing those family photos and you see people as human beings, kids, all the rest of it, who have hopes and dreams and fears, and who love and are loved, it becomes a lot harder to do terrible things to them. So I'm just wondering about that dehumanization and how you changed it. That was a very long question. I do apologize.
Yeah. When I was a soldier in the Jenin area guarding the fence, we were patrolling the fence between the Jenin area and Israel. And it's this what we call a smart fence, which when someone touches it, then you get an indication and then you go there with your Jeep. And one time we had this, and there were two kids who were gotta be, from my memory, at least the maximum 8, maybe 7, 8-year-olds. And they touched the fence. I don't know what they were doing there. But our commander, our officer, he had this idea that they were maybe sent to touch the fence in order to test how fast it takes us to get to that point. And therefore, in order to kind of ruin their idea or their scheme, we will arrest these kids so they know not to try to think about doing anything funny, you know. So basically, we had a reason why to arrest these kids for touching the fence. And I was sent to arrest these 2 kids and put them in a military jeep and drive up to our base and put them in this little room, and it made
Unbelievable. Like, could you imagine arresting kids in America? And how desensitized do you have to be to just arrest them, put them in your Jeep? Imagine how intimidated you made them. Imagine how they're probably traumatized for life because of that. They're going to be scared of the idea for life. You don't think that's going to continue the cycle?
sense for a second. And then I was holding these 2 kids, brothers maybe, or friends, and closing the Jeep, and they were crying, terrified, holding each other, and they were looking at me, and they were terrified for me, you know, and I'm a good guy. Why would anybody be so terrified for me, a 7-year-old? And then I realized I'm kidnapping these kids, you know. There was some kind of military logic for a second there. Why? And then you see what you're doing. And then, as you said, when you're at that point, when you're armed and you're arresting these little kids, and you don't want to feel, nobody wants to feel like you're doing something bad. So dehumanization in that moment could be really helpful, you know. So generally speaking, as you said, I think that the more you need to control other people, and controlling them through intimidation, through putting their heads down, through humiliation. Yeah, you need to also, it's more difficult to do that if you see their humanity, for sure. And I think this war really crystallized something for me, and I think it might be true for both sides. Not that I can speak about the other side because I'm not Palestinian, but I think that there's this narrative of it's either us or them. There's no space for both of us on this land. And there are a lot of people who believe that, between the river and the sea. And it goes to our government and actually many of people in the opposition, but it's also true to the Hamas and the kind of ideology they serve. And once you believe that there's no space for both people to live peacefully in the land or at all, then you have to turn to dehumanization, because either us or them means that one of us needs to be either exterminated or transferred out. And to accept that idea, I think it's quite difficult. So I think, again, dehumanization is really helpful for holding on to that narrative, which is probably the majority of Israelis. I hope not. I hope I'm wrong. And I think this is also what has been crystallized for me in these days as an activist, is that we have to crack that narrative. It seems so simple and maybe even like kumbaya-ish, like, oh, there's place for both nations on this land. But I believe that the narrative is so important because it also serves Israeli violence and continuing the war. Because if there's really no space for both of us, and it's either Palestinians who can live on this land or Israelis, then this pushes Israelis to this corner where they feel more justified with their actions. If you only believe that it's either us or them, then war is the only option. It's very fertile land for war and dehumanization. So I believe that is kind of something that we need to put our focus on right now.